Hi chess fans, we look at the game between Jakec Dubiel with white, rated 2400, against Igor Khenkin with black, rated 2600. The game was played in the Oberliga in Germany in 2011. White played e5, and after c6 we reach the Caro Kann, and white chooses to play the advanced variation. And in this position, one main line is, or the most popular line is, to play bishop f5 with the idea of playing e6, stabilizing the position, but not caging the bishop in, and then having the break c5 at the later point in time to attack white's center. Khenkin in this position played another theory line, which is c5, and c5 immediately attacks the white center. Looks a bit funny because you have played first c6 and then you're playing c5, moving the pawn a second time, but the idea is to create an imbalance in the position immediately. And let's have a look at this very interesting imbalance as it unfolds in the game. White takes on c5, and now white is a pawn up, but white's center is a little bit shattered, and in fact both of these pawns can become weak. So black immediately plays e6, and again he has now a clear target here on c5, potentially also on e5, and if he ever wins back the pawn, he will be up in he will have a lead in development potentially. If white tries to defend the pieces, black has the opportunity to discoordinate white's pieces, and then white of course has an extra pawn at the moment, and this extra pawn, if white is able to maintain it into an ending, white will be won. So immediately we have this disbalance in the game, and I found this game very interesting because in this game white tries to hang on to the pawn on c5, and we will see very illustratively how this can backfire. So probably the strongest move in this position is to just play knight f3 and give back the pawn immediately, and simply argue that after, for example, bishop d3, both sides just develop, knight c6, castle, knight to e7. White is simply arguing, okay, you have this bad bishop now, I'm going to be able to protect this pawn, and material is equal, but I'm going to play against the bad bishop. This is probably the best way to play for white. Just to look very briefly at what black can do nonetheless, if white now, for example, plays bishop f4 to protect the pawn, black can castle and then play f5 here. And the idea is that after e takes, queen takes, white can exchange a few pieces and then push the pawn forward and liberate the bishop in this way. But of course there are ways to play for white against this. Okay, but probably that's why in this position knight f3 is the strongest move, simply giving back the pawn immediately. But many opponents might feel, wow, I'm going to keep this pawn, and again white played bishop e3. Another way is not so good, playing b4 to protect the pawn. Black can immediately lever up with a5, and after c3, of course a3 would lose the rook. So after c3, black takes, white takes, and black has a second lever b6. And if black now tries to protect the pawn with bishop e3, if white tries to protect the pawn, black can take, and then black has a number of resources of attacking this pawn, and the pawn will in the end fall. White can try to defend with queen c2, but after queen a5 check, knight to d2, black already won back the pawn and has a better position because he's simply better developed. Okay, so b4 is not a good way to protect the pawn, and white tried bishop e3. And let's have a look on how play against this pawn here unfolds in the game. Black played knight h6 is actually a main move in this line, and the goal is to play the knight to f5 and attack the defender. And if white takes this pawn, then black is up in development, and it's yet to be shown how white can take advantage of that Black will win back the pawn, and the material is equal, and black has this slightly worse pawn structure here, but on the other hand, this pawn becomes weak, and black will try to win a pawn. So, but bishop h6 is generally nothing that black has to be afraid of. Another way to prevent the knight coming there might be g4, but black can simply gang up on the pawn in different ways. And then win back the pawn in the end as well. So also g4, just preventing this knight plan isn't really much, isn't really posing any danger to black. So white continued c3 with the idea of b4 to protect the pawn. Knight d7. Again, in general, a black strategy is to play knight d7 and then maybe the queen here and just attack the pawn with all these pieces. Bishop b5, pinning the knight. Knight f5, black is completing the plan to remove one of the defenders. White plays bishop to d4. And if black takes here, white can retake with the pawn and would be absolutely fine. But black first played a6, inviting the bishop to move back, and then remove the pin by castling, as we have seen in the earlier variation. For example, knight to e2, castle, and now the knight is ready to take the pawn. And if white takes, black can bring in the rook and win the pawn in this way. Okay. After a6, white exchanged this knight, saying, okay, you need this knight to attack the pawn on c5, so I'm happy to exchange it. But black can take with the bishop, and after knight f3, and exchanging this bishop, black is ganging up on the pawn with the rook. If in this position white would have taken with the pawn, black can simply, because he controls the square here, he can simply play b6, threatening taking the pawn and winning the pawn. And if takes, in this particular position, black has pressure on the pawn on b3. And after queen exchange, check, black is a pawn down, but he can probably win back some of these pawns and is probably better in this position. And if black is sacrificing the pawn and white tries to defend with b3, this is very bad because it weakens the dark squares and the king still hasn't castled. So if white was to retake with this pawn, essentially the problem is, or what saves black is the weakness on b2 and the king which hasn't castled, and all of this is exploited with the move b6. So black is holding the position together thanks to these motives, even after white plays c takes d. But in the game, white played out the queen to d4, and black is ganging up against the pawn. White wanted to defend this pawn with the move b4, but again, also in this position, black has this lever with b6. And after c6, black simply retook the pawn. If in this position c takes, quick tactical question, what are the motives that black has here? White has the tactical liability of the queen here on d4, which is vulnerable because it's coming out early in the game and the king still hasn't castled, and black can take advantage of this by playing rook c4, and after, for example, queen e3, maintaining coordination with the pawn, black can pin the queen against the king and win, and so the queen has to give up coordination with the pawn, which allows black to win back this pawn. And in this position, black is a pawn down, but has strong compensation because both of these pawns are weak. Okay, so that's why white played c6, giving up the pawn and saying, okay, I got the space advantage. I'm gonna castle and I'm gonna try to limit the activity of your bishops. black develops, and after castle, white plays rook e1 to protect one of the weaknesses. And now black strategy. What should black strategy be in this position? So black strategy essentially now is to attack the weaknesses that black has. So there's one weakness here, and this weakness on c3 is maybe even more severe because these two pieces are currently guarding this pawn. So black strategy is to move the bishop out of the way, to unleash the rook on the pawn. White is attacking one of black's weaknesses here, but black is simply ignoring it and moving the queen to c6 to gang up further on the weakness on c3. So why can white not take here? Black has rook a8, and if queen moves back, black simply wins back this pawn, like this, because the bishop and the rook together coordinate. Okay, so it doesn't really help white to take on a3. So that's why white played knight to d4, and this move maybe looks a bit funny, but the plan is to move the knight to e2 to protect this weakness. So black is already in the driver's seat. The material is equal, and white has these weaknesses. Black played queen c4, arguing that if white exchanges here, this simply helps black to develop his rook, and still the weaknesses and the pressure remain in the position. So white doesn't want that and plays queen to d1. And now in this position, very, very instructively, positionally. So what is the worst piece in black's camp? The worst piece is this rook. Okay, so black wants to activate this rook. And in the position, what is ways to activate black's rook? So one idea might be to simply double the rooks. Okay, after all, we are attacking this weakness and we want to double the rook. But what's the problem with this strategy? The problem is the queen does not have the c7 square anymore to move back. So the tactical motive is, or the tactical liability is, the queen doesn't have any squares. This square is controlled by the opponent, this square, this square, this square. All of those squares here are already controlled by the opponent, so you can see it only needs one move to attack the queen. And if white plays rook e3, protecting this pawn so that in the next move this pawn is ready to attack the queen. And if black, for example, would just continue doubling the rooks, then the queen is lost. So that's why activating the rook on f8 by doubling it is not such a good strategy. But what might be an alternative way to activate this rook? It's what black played in the game, f6. So this has the dual purpose of getting rid of this pawn, opening the position and freeing these bishops in the way, because if this position gets opened, these bishops are more powerful, and activating this rook. It's a very instructive move. How many of you guys would have doubled the rook here? Because we're all focused on playing against this weakness. But f6 is actually a very strong move because it activates the rook and frees up the bishops. So white does not want to take here, because it would just help black freeing up and developing his pieces. There are already some motives in this position which make it very dangerous for white. So black already has some threats. For example, after rook a3 with the plan of protecting this weakness and freeing up this knight, runs into f takes e. And if rook takes, bishop b4, and the point is that after taking, we can take this knight, we have just won a pawn. And the problem, the tactical liability, is the back rank weakness. So this is something that is already an issue here. So black is threatening to take here, and this rook is the piece who has to take back, and then we are overloading the queen who's protecting the back rank. So that's a tactical liability in this position. Another tactical or another positional liability or threat in this position is after, for example, h3, let's say white sees this and wants to remove the back rank weakness. Black also threatens to take here, but now the purpose or the threat of taking is not the back rank weakness, but bishop f6, The rook moves back and taking, and now positionally the rook is entering the 7th rank. And black is winning because he now has this very strong positional resource. Okay, so after f6, all of these things are threatening. The rook entering and the back rank weakness. So as a consequence, white played f4, trying to avoid retaking with the rook and countering these threats. Now the back rank weakness is also at least not threatening mate and some variations. But black uses this opportunity to simply trade, and now this rook is activated. Black has reached his goal. And the rook comes in immediately to attack and to activate. So in this position here, rook f4, what is this move threatening? Let's have a look at how the game continues. White continues to pursue his plan with knight e2, protecting the pawn and thereby freeing up this knight, and once this knight moves, maybe also this rook. But black plays rook g4, and if in this position white doesn't do anything, for example, now that this knight is freed, the knight maybe moves in here to attack the queen, then the queen can invade. And if in this position, for example, the rook activates itself, we want to bring it behind the pawn. Black has already a lot of threats here, and suddenly all the pieces become active against the king, while white's pieces are very uncoordinated. So that's why in this position here, white played knight to d4, just playing the knight back to this safe square, giving up the strategy of defending this pawn for now, and the white queen is attacking the rook on g4. The rook moves to e4, and the idea is that after takes and exchange, black has created a strong positional resource. So white is already under a lot of pressure. Black's pieces become more and more active after every move, and in a way knight d4 is already trying to bail out on this, but black very coolly plays rook to e2. If the rook moves to f1, for example, of course, black can take this pawn and win a pawn, but let's just imagine this was not possible. It also allows white to exchange some of the pieces, and then these uncoordinated pieces here remain, and black's pieces are very quick to enter the attack. Okay, but of course the pawn was hanging, so white was taking this pawn, and now black's plan was to create this positional resource of a passed pawn. And white's pieces are so uncoordinated and messed up here that black is actually a few pieces up, and the pawn will simply march. And the whole theme of the rest of the game is how black uses this passed pawn, the resource of the passed pawn. White tries to defend the pawn. And to free up these pieces, knight to d2 to defend the pawn might have been met with rook f8. And if the knight now tries to activate, again, black has this route with queen d3 penetrating the position. So there are a few threats that black is having now. And again, themes like bishop to g5 are very strong. So after queen d2, black played h6 with the plan of activating the bishop. White tries to get some counterplay, played a5, but black simply very coolly says, okay, what's your rook doing over there? And in this position, rook f8 threatens mate, and queen e2 is already a bailout move by white. If the queen, for example, moved to d1, the black bishop comes in, and all the threats of like this check and the double attack on the knight, etc., in the position, and this bishop becomes a monster. So white tries to bail out and at least avoid the mate by playing queen e2, and black happily exchanges the queens. And the point is that now black is fully utilizing the power of the bishop pair together with this passed pawn, and black doesn't need the queens anymore to win this game. So look at this fantastic bishop. It's caging in the rook here on a5. It's protecting this pawn, is making sure that white's passed pawn stays where it is because it controls the squares. It's attacking knight now. It's also helping. It's also helping the pawn to advance. If this knight moves, the rook together with the bishop threatens mate. So this is just a fantastic piece. White played knight g3. Already this knight is now tied up to the defense of the square on f2. And black still has this resource of the pawn advancing. So look, even though nominally the material is equal, black is totally winning here. Look at what the engine says, right? So all of these resources now lead to black having a totally won position. Okay, rook a1, e2, knight to d2, attacking the knight and activating the second bishop. Bishop e3, the king has to move back, creating another tactical resource, which is a back rank weakness. Threatening to queen the pawn, the knight has to move in, and now simply bishop to d4, threatening mate. The rook is coming in, and the knight is blocking the rook for the defense. So if knight f3, black with his last bishop move was also threatening to take on c3, establishing control of the queening square and attacking the rook. So all of this pressure just had as a consequence that white was resigning here in this position. Okay, so very, very interesting. This very topical game, in my opinion, for this line in the Caro Kann. If black plays c5 here, white takes, and after e6, again, the strongest move is knight f3. And the whole point is that if white embarks on an adventure to protect this pawn, this might very easily backfire. And black typically is in the end able to win back this pawn. The white pieces are played by a strong grandmaster, and black simply has so many resources to win back the pawn, least of all the b6 lever here. And even though it looks white has established the strong defense here, in the end black just wins back the pawn, and white is left with these two weaknesses. And as we have seen, black simply has to move back the bishop and attack those weaknesses. And after some time, the white's position was just breaking down. Black was taking advantage of the bishops, created this resource with the passed pawn. Of course, the game still continues, but at least black has two weaknesses to play against here. So thanks a lot for watching. I hope you learned a lot from this game, and see you again next time.